Hello, everyone. Philip Lee returning with a new episode of Civil War Chat. Click on the subscribe button down here in the lower right to subscribe, and then also the notification bell in the far upper right to subscribe. Today, I want to talk about tariffs. This topic is the biggest misunderstood topic of the Civil War. So let me get right into it. I'm going to show you that it was not the South that went to war over tariffs. It was the North that went to war over tariffs. And there's two ways I'm going to demonstrate this. One is by showing you what happened after the war. And second, I'm going to show you what the arguments were before the war and how those arguments have been distorted by academia, distorted to the point that they're just utterly corrupted and intentionally, I think, misleading, or if not intentionally, if it's misleading, just reflecting a rote memorization of earlier propaganda. So let's just leave it at that. And so here's the point about the postbellum evidence of what caused the war, or the issue of tariffs during the war. On the eve of the Civil War, tariffs were 19% on dutiable items. For the next 50 years, the tariffs averaged 45%. So until a Southerner, Woodrow Wilson, entered the White House in 1913, tariffs averaged on dutiable items 45%, which is more than double where they were on the eve of the Civil War. They rose from 19% to 45% for 50 years. So what does that tell you? Who was motivated to fight about tariffs? And what kind of tariff were they motivated to implement? Well, what we got was higher tariffs, and we got them for 50 years. So clearly the winners wanted higher tariffs, and they imposed them for 50 years. Wilson, after 8 years in the presidency, the Democrats were kicked out, and you got into the roaring 20s, and the Republicans went right back into high tariffs, right back into it. In fact, the United States did not become a free trade nation until after World War II. And that's because the manufacturing states north of the Ohio River and the Mason-Dixon line wanted low tariffs after World War II because they realized, hey, we've got no competition anywhere in the world for manufactured goods. So if we can get everybody to lower the tariffs, we can have a monopoly over the whole world. And that kind of monopolistic thinking is what drove them from the beginning. From the beginning. And what this shows is don't let yourself be misled that these changes were just temporary. They lasted a century, essentially. Okay, that's what happened after the war. We can see the Northerners got what they wanted. They got high tariffs. That was their motivation. They fought the war. They won the war. They got high tariffs. Now, secondly, what was the situation before the war? What were the arguments before the war? Well, commonly, this is so misunderstood, particularly by Southerners that are trying to make a case that the South paid most of the tariffs. That's a losing argument. The tariffs on the eve of the Civil War were about $63 million. But the manufactured goods sold to the southern states by the northern states, plus the shipping and insurance and banking services that they provided, as well as the annual trips from the plantation owners to the northern states to buy goods and services for their plantations, principally goods, that totaled about $350 million. $350 million versus 63 million. Tariffs on the eve of the Civil War, 63 million. Markets, products sold to the South by the Northerners, 350 million. The differential ratio there is over 5 to 1, almost 6 to 1, right? 6 times as large. The market for northern goods in the South, manufactured goods and related items in the South was 6 times the size of all the tariffs collected. So we don't have to argue too much about who paid for the tariffs. Let's look at what happened to that Southern market and who was concerned about it. Well, 10 of the northern states passed joint resolutions in their legislatures explaining why they opposed Southern secession. And the common theme was, we want to preserve the Union. And that's the glorified term they use for it. That's the noble term they use for it. But why did they want to conserve? They explained, why did they want to preserve the Union? Well, because the joint resolutions say, because the Union has been a source of prosperity for the states. And keep in mind, this is coming from people that were originally, 13 different colonies, 13 different states. So they found that, by being in the Union, it promoted prosperity for all of the states. That was the point, that these 10 northern states that passed these resolutions during the winter of 1860-61 said, this is why we oppose Southern secession, because we feel that the Union has led to prosperity. We want to continue, perpetuate that prosperity. Well, what's prosperity? It's economics, right? What are they saying? They really want to resist Southern secession over economic issues, not slavery, not slavery. They could have let the South secede, the 7 cotton states plus South Carolina, the 7 Gulf states plus South Carolina. They could have let them secede and then be rid of most of the slavery. They didn't want that. They wanted the economic benefits of the Southern markets. And more important than that, they did not want an independent nation on their southern border that had low tariffs, because not only would they then lose their southern markets, the northern states would then be subjected to possible smuggling, product coming in from Europe into the southern states and smuggled out of the southern states into the northern states. Now, that wouldn't necessarily be Southerners doing the smuggling. In fact, there's a strong case to be made that it would be the Yankees themselves that would be doing the smuggling. Consider the War of 1812, which lasted about 4 years. New England refused to provide its militia to the United States Army. New England traded, well, Massachusetts specifically, but New England generally traded with the British during that war. At that time, New England was the major trading center of the United States, and they traded with the enemy openly. They did not even get blockaded by the British until the last 7 months of the war. But once they got blockaded, then their illegal trade, the prosperity of their illegal trade was shut down, and they were frantic. So they call a convention in Hartford, Connecticut, December 1815. And they come up with a number of resolutions. Much of it is secret, but it's known that they did send emissaries to the president. And I think at that time it was either Madison or Monroe. And they were with ultimatums. And if they did not get their ultimatums, the implied threat was they would go back to the convention, and secession was on the table. They didn't say it specifically, but the New England states had threatened secession before. The northern states and the New England states had threatened secession before. In fact, secession was an argument used fairly consistently by whoever was in the minority at the time up until the Civil War. So here they were trading illegally with the enemy, while American soldiers are dying fighting the British. The New Englanders are trading, making a lot of money off of them. If they had that kind of morality during the War of 1812, is there any doubt that they would have been at the lead of the smugglers that would take imported goods out of the low tariff South and distribute it in the high tariff North? Can't be any doubt about that. It was an economic issue. Keep in mind, this is such an important point to realize, because the academics do not teach it, and people consistently fail to recognize it. The optimal protective tariff, the theoretically optimal protective tariff, use the word deterrence tariff, perhaps that explains it better. The optimal one generates zero tariff revenues. Why does it generate zero tariff revenues? Because the optimal protective tariff totally blocks imports. Now, on the eve of the Civil War, one of the industries that was most forceful about exercising their influence to get protective tariffs was the iron products industry in Pennsylvania, where Thaddeus Stevens, later, a longtime curmudgeon who hated Southerners, he owned an iron mill. But it was all the iron products manufacturers. They wanted a high tariff because they could not compete on price and quality with the British steel and iron. So, as an example, in the first year after the Civil War had ended and the South was desperately trying to rebuild their railroads, they could buy railroad iron in Liverpool for $32 a ton, but it sold for $80 a ton in the United States because of the high tariffs and the shipping costs. But it was clearly the high tariffs that were the major factor. So keep in mind that when we make an argument for tariffs being a cause of the war, you have to look at who benefited and who had something to lose. And by far, it was the Northerners that feared the loss much more than the Southerners. The Southerners would gain by having lower tariffs. Prices of imported goods would go down. There would be a more ready market for their export because the British bought all the they bought American cotton vigorously, aggressively, but they would have been even more aggressive if they knew that they did not have to deal with trying to sell their goods into a country that had tariffs opposing them. You see, in those days, the way that you got the money to import goods was by selling exports. So if British could not export to the United States or to the southern states, either one, they would therefore not get the exchange credits, meaning the dollars needed to buy the southern product, the American products. Well, the principal American products that were exported was southern cotton, and that market was hurt by high protective tariffs because it created resentment among the South's best cotton customers. It led them, for example, to look at doing business with Egypt and with Western Africa and with Brazil and with India, trying to get cotton from those places where they could easily sell manufactured goods without facing a tariff. Well, I have talked about tariffs before, but I'm coming back to it, and I'm doing this informally without notes because it is so often overlooked. I've made this point over and over and over, but when I go online into the various forums, I can see that nobody realizes this, or almost nobody realizes it, and they continually try to focus on how much of the tariff was paid by Southerners and how much of the tariff was paid by Northerners. That is not the point. And also they focus on, well, the South didn't list in their reasons of secession. Their complaints about the tariff were not as prominent. It wasn't the South that went to war over tariffs. It was the North that went to war over tariffs. It was the North that wanted high tariffs and would fight a war to get them. And after they won the war, they implemented them. What more proof could you possibly want? Okay, that's our message for today. But I do want to point out to you that my recent book of Causes of the Civil War, I want to urge you to get a copy of it. We have an audible version of it, which means that you can listen to it while you're driving or while you're exercising. It's available at Amazon.com. And if you want a copy from Amazon.com of the printed book, it's $16. You can also get the audible copy of the book there. And then lastly, if you want a autographed copy of the book, then email me, Phil_Leigh, Leigh, at me.com. And I'll sell it to you for $26, but I will cover the postage. Okay, that's our show for today, and thanks for watching.